I am what is considered by society fellow member of Gen Z.
And I'm hoping to gain some insight on Gen Z from your perspective and things you hear from your friends and observations that you make, and probably talking about from COVID and all the changes that has happened in the last few years. Did COVID-19 have a big impact on people your age?
For sure, for sure. I guess the first thought that comes to mind when I think about COVID and how it affected everybody, and by me, like everybody, school was shut down. At first, everyone's all excited. Oh my gosh, we got 2 weeks off. Turns to a month, a couple months, and then people are starting to really miss school and getting out. And then it's that whole year that we lose because of this, worldwide pandemic. And for my kind of generation, it's like, I guess it's a lot of feeling of missing out. For a lot. I didn't have a normal prom. That's what I didn't have.
Okay.
So I didn't have a normal prom. We did have a graduation, and that was like, mask mandate, everything still had to be in place, obviously.
So it shifted from you being isolated at home to where you really weren't out and about with friends. You're spending a much more significant time at home than at school with all of your friends.
Yes, and unfortunately, I didn't really take that time to actually look at what's going on. I just, day by day was passing the time, getting bored, and just staying on, the technology we have, social media. I think it was a really hard time, mostly because I couldn't really, obviously it was hard for everyone to adapt to that change. I just, being the person I am, it was really hard for me to just stay in my room 24/7 and not be able to go out at all.
Well, and then other things happened. So there was civil unrest going on.
Mm-hmm.
There was the political division across the country, global issues with, wars, human rights violations globally. How did that start framing your thought, or how did that start impacting your view of the world and your view of your future?
Well, I'm obviously realizing it more now than I did during COVID, with all of this, with all these acts of warfare and all these basically going against human rights going on. Thinking about it now, it's still a heavy topic for me to completely get a full grasp onto, especially since it's always changing and always something new comes on. Another issue that people have to look at and determine if this is really a turning point for the world, if it's really getting worse and we are struggling to find solutions. It definitely affects how I perceive the world now, and how I'm unsure of how my future will turn out. Obviously, because I'm living in this big world where nothing I think is certain in my path.
So the norm now is uncertainty, and I'm sure you probably hear from your circle of influence people that may share some of the same sentiments.
For sure, yeah. It was well, during COVID, obviously everyone's isolated. It's almost all the same here. Everyone nobody wants to stay in their homes 24/7. As humans, more socialites, being out. I hear that a lot from peers. Usually that comment where they just don't like being inside.
Well, we were talking earlier when we were talking about how sometimes there's a saying, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And you were saying you've seen that paradigm shift to where now it seems to be kind of optimism is not there. Describe that. What is your take on that, or what's your perception of that?
Yeah, Yeah, that is interesting. My overall perspective with the optimism or lack thereof in this time frame and in this, with everything going on, it's definitely lacking. And with my generation having to be, well, in this specific time frame, we're the ones that are needing to adapt quicker with everything going on at this pace, and with us not being able to slow it down. Obviously, it's not in our control. Definitely affects us mentally, physically, emotionally, all the above. With that saying, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. I don't see that kind of much in my generation. More of like the shift in it, where I see people just always focusing on the negative. And when I ask some peers about it, obviously they talk about their struggles and how it's really impacted them, but they never really give me an answer where they shift it and try to, think positively. Just because of the heavy influence of everything that's going on right now. I think it takes a heavy toll on the mental state of like every teenager.
So you yourself, we were talking, there's times that you've seen it manifest in depression. Describe that, like, with conversations you have with friends, like, I would say isolation, maybe anxiety, depression, those kind of things. What are things that you've had discussions with friends, and what have you felt, and how have you seen yourself like isolate sometimes from people, and what reasons? Just describe that.
Yeah, so the first discussion that comes to mind is one of my good peers I've known since middle school. Me and him were talking on that subject of since the future is it's not looking too predictable right now. Obviously it never is, but especially now, with everything going on, it's kind of hard to imagine. For me and him both think of having a family in the future. It's hard to imagine for us and for others that have the same idea. How would that go? How do we go about dealing with these problems and that on top of it? It's definitely caused some distraught, some sadness, myself and him, because it's really difficult trying to plan out when you obviously don't know what's going to happen.
So it's almost like a fear of planning because you don't know what the future holds. So you're thinking, is this going to be a waste of time, or am I going to have to readjust again and again and again because we don't know what we don't know? Obvious.
That's a point that many of people my age think of, and unfortunately most of them choose not to think of and overlook that idea and just live on their daily lives without, questioning these topics, these matters that we have in our hands. I'd say going into the depression, I myself kind of built a little bit of depression off of the isolation from COVID coming out, mostly because I'm more of a social kind of person, and it was hard being alone. But I like to think the term of being alone and being lonely are two different things. I'd say being lonely is that demand for someone else to be there that we all feel, that we all think we need in order to live out our daily lives normally, or what society has deemed as normally. That you should have a lot of friends, and that if you're alone, like you're not normal. I tend to hear that a lot.
So you see that it is possible to be alone but not lonely.
Yes.
I've heard that comment from many people over the last probably couple of years of COVID. They say alone but never lonely.
I think myself, in the state I'm in right now, I can say confidently I'm in that phrase right there.
And so that alone time, what does that do for you? Why are you drawn to that? And why are you drawn to pushing away short-term or long-term from others so that you can have that alone space? Like, what does it bring to you?
It's more of learning to space out the fast-paced environments from the more slower-paced environments. I'd say being alone is honestly a good skill to have, because if you're able to be alone and able to really slow down and take in the environment around you wherever you may be, it really allows you to gain more focus, more concentration on your thoughts, on your perspective, on how you perceive the world you're living in right now. I think it's a really great skill to have for anybody, and I recommend that anyone that is struggling from either feeling alone, feeling lonely, and thinking that they need people in order to really be themselves. Because I don't really think anyone needs people to be themselves.
So is your take that sometimes to be around other people is masking our ability to cope with what's real? And so you rather would confront that alone and being, like you said earlier to me, with nature and things like that, so that you could develop that coping skill and know that it's not from being around everybody, it's from you truly reflecting on your life and the world and all those things.
Yeah, I truly think it comes from within. And while it is, of course, I'm not saying it's wrong to shut out everything and like just being alone, is that it is nice to have people there, obviously, but
it's like a balance.
Yeah, it should be a balance with being alone and being surrounded by others. I think the idea of knowing who you really are should be from within, and should be from you realizing that without the help of others. That's the intent of
So as you go through that, do you encounter people that misunderstand, or they like, hey, we're worried about you, how come you want to go on a walk on the ocean by yourself, or whatever it is, and how do you help them understand that this isn't a negative thing, that it's actually, you know, finding myself and understanding myself in the world we live in? How do you get them to understand what you're dealing with so that maybe they can grow and expand the way that they're thinking too?
Yeah, so most people aren't really much open-minded to understand this kind of concept, which unfortunately is most of the Gen Z population, I feel.
So they're more interdependent with friendships, and that is something like that they draw more to than you think other generations?
Yeah, definitely so. I believe Gen Z is more of a socially dependent generation. But when it comes to explaining to people my 2 cents of it is, throughout life, the only thing promised in life is death, and the only thing constant in life is change. In the end, you only have yourself. Although I'm not saying that as like you shouldn't, you know, trust people, but in reality, you only have yourself. That is something you will always have, is yourself. So when I tell people that, and I tell them, if you build your mindset strong on solely focusing on yourself, not falling victim to any distractions like social media.
So developing your independence, because that's a safe place to be, or safer.
Yeah.
And then having that balance with interdependence, but also the ability to be independent.
Yeah. I think you should develop a strong mindset to where if something goes wrong, interdependent with other people, you can always just step back. You always have yourself, and you'll have a great mindset in order to reflect on, let's say, how that relationship went, or how that thing went, and really reflect with your true thoughts and with what you truly think.
How does this shore up within the family? For example, what challenges have you seen? You know, parents are going through a different kind of stress as they went through the pandemic. A stress of they hope they don't get COVID, and especially in the earlier times when COVID was much more deadly, we started seeing that the treatment started getting better and better, but also worried about their kids getting it and all those things. What did you notice in the family dynamics, and how do you kind of reconcile that with your way of dealing with it, which is that balance of aloneness as well as interdependence? And how were you able to communicate that, like with your parents, so that they kind of go, okay, I get what you're saying, or I can see where you're coming from, or whatever.
Yeah. So in COVID, my parents were obviously. We can all agree the first thing that comes to a parent's mind is their children. Obviously, when it comes to something as, you know, dangerous as a worldwide pandemic. My family obviously took heavy precaution at the start, and then during isolation, of course, we were just following the directions that were listed, you know, and to all people that were, you know, everybody, basically, the whole world. And I think as it died down, our kind of like the way we dealt with it kind of died down as well with my parents, just because they're heavy workers. So even though there was that worldwide pandemic going on, yes, we did isolate, but then when we got out of it and then mask mandates came out and stuff, you know, they just got back to work. Just told us always wear a mask. And then I was, by this time, still not back in school, but I had soccer to go back to, always wear a mask, which made it hard for a sport where you move around like that, but I think the way I handled it, because all our perspectives were different with COVID. With my parents, they were worrying about us, and I was worrying about, you know, them as well, about if I were to go out, I need to be cautious of what I bring back. And even though I have that at the time, just like every other teenager, had that urge to go out again and like try to make everything normal again, try to place things into my control again, I had to realize that it wasn't that way at all, that this is still a worldwide pandemic and we still have to take major precaution.
So you kind of reconcile this is the new normal.
Yeah.
You knew it wasn't going to go back to the way it was before.
No, and we can still see that today with obviously some mandates off now, but still see a lot of people wearing masks just because you never know. But my family handled it pretty well. Like, I think we all only got COVID once, and it lasted for like not even a week. And we just stayed in home and like sat it out. But
so now when you talk about aloneness, and then you talk about your best friend who you shared with me earlier, what if your best friend is feeling hurt because of your wanting aloneness? Like you talked earlier about, some people would think like, well, you know, don't isolate yourself or whatever. So your best friend is your mom. How did you, was there a time when you kind of started having a desire for more time alone, that your mom is like, what's going on with you? Or were you more like, you know what, Mom, I've started thinking, and you just sharing your thoughts, or what did that play out like?
Yeah, I'd say I've definitely been more involved with that kind of act with my mother. As in, like, I'm talking to her more about like what's going on in the world, even though I know she's not really, she's just a hard worker and not really into like looking at the news that much. Still try and share like some, you know, thoughts I'm having on it. And that change kind of surprised her a little bit. Now we just have occasional talks about whatever's going on or whatever we want to talk about, but it's only occasional, mostly because she's working every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I know she has a lot on her mind, and I always try to help out with my sisters and stuff like that. One of the talks that we've had that's kind of been most influential was about relationships with my mother. And her main, the main thing she says, it's like, yeah, blah, blah, that, blah, blah, but I'm always your mother. So she tells me.
Dose of truth.
She tells me the truth. She tells me, yeah, well, I'm always your mother. Remember that. Which I'm always, you know, I'll always know. Always.
Moms have that sense when they tell us, you know, be careful of this friend or that friend or this relationship or that, and then we don't want to tell them later.
You were right.
Mom was spot on, yeah.
Yeah.
Because then they say, I told you.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the generation, Gen Z, I know statistically there's been an uptick in suicidal thoughts and things like that. Do you see that, or do you ever hear of friends like sometimes saying, you know what, I don't even know why I'm in this world, or does that cross people's minds, or do people feel free to talk about those things so that they're willing to tell their friend, like, I'm in a bad place, I need help? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that talk is more of to friends than talking to their parents about it.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it a couple times with some of my peers, and obviously I don't take any of that as a joke.
Yeah.
So I would take time to talk to them about it, what they actually think, or if they're just in a hard spot and they don't really mean it.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously life is hard. Life isn't fair. And these are the things we have to learn growing up. And of course it gets very overwhelming, especially with everything going on in a short time span. And my generation being the peak of going into adulthood with all this going on. It's obviously it takes a heavy toll on how we think and how we might not like be able to do stuff like in the future.
So you're the oldest of three sisters, and their ages are different.
Yeah.
And so you're having a lot of cross-generational, and the oldest generally is, you know, much harder on themselves because you have all that responsibility. Do you see they've kind of have the similar stressors in life now, or are some of them too young that they really haven't thought that deep about these kind of things?
For sure the oldest has.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say the middle is too young, but she's starting to. And the other one's just too young, mm-hmm. obviously, but they still see things and tend to, you know, think about it, which I encourage.
So you have conversations with them,
yeah,
so that they kind of know this is okay to talk about.
Yeah, obviously, because I think the more you talk about certain issues, the more you'll learn mm-hmm. from them. The more you'll adapt to these certain scenarios, to where the next time it happens or something similar, mm-hmm. you won't be caught off guard, or you won't be that vulnerable to it.
So they know that you're also providing a safe place for them to know they can always come to you because you see some of these things too, kind of thing.
That too, because I think the thing with safe place everyone should have, One being like a locational safe place, two being a person you could talk to as a safe place, or a place where you could just sit down and think to yourself as a safe place. So I talked to them a bit about that, mostly the oldest. She's in high school right now. And she is on social media a lot. I think that's what kind of affects the way she perceives these issues going on, because me and her don't really have the same perspective on what's this or what's that right now. But instead of, you know, arguments, I try to like ask, what do you think about it? Or gain insight that I might not have had prior to that conversation.
So reflecting within yourself and with peers that you've heard talk, what are some of the greatest fears? Like that people look out at the future, and I'll just name some things again: global conflict, you have the environmental issues, you know, you have our country's divided against itself, you know, there's a lot of polarization, and the economy people talk about. What are some of the fears that keep you up at night, if you will, and your friends?
That's a great question. I'd say, I think especially now, since we're all, me and my peers in college, the greatest fear is if we're making the right choice, either staying in college with our major, what we want to be in the future. I think that overlapped with the fact that a future might not be possible. It's kind of a strong fear factor that we think of these days, because me personally, I'm not for sure what I want to do. And right now I'm just, you know, trying to get my bearings around what's going on first and adapting to these situations, and still keeping an eye on anything that I find interesting that I might want to do. But I guess another fear could be not being certain of, or not having a path right now, set path right now.
And how would you describe your light at the end of the tunnel? That you kind of look way down the road and say, you know what, I'm going to have some hope in this, and I'm going to try to stay focused there. What would that be for you?
Faith, I'd say. Faith, and knowing that my plan right now and my soon-to-be plan mixed with God's plan in the end will be positive, and will lead me to prosper. I like to think what you give, you get in the end. So on my path through life, I like to give positivity, kindness, all that. But I also don't expect it back. I just have faith that my path will be one that'll make me work hard, one that will help me learn and make me stronger overall as a person. So I just try to stay positive as much as I can, even in the hardest times, even if it seems like positivity shouldn't even be a factor. It always is in my day-to-day life.
What haven't I touched on that you think is important to touch on?
That obviously I know life is, and it's funny because I talk to peers about it, and they know what they have to do, but they don't do it. So life is so difficult, and will throw a lot of things at you. And what you gotta stay is motivated. And another saying I like to think of, I can't remember who said it though. It was an athlete, but I can't remember their name at the moment. It was like, if motivation lacks, that's where discipline comes in. And strong discipline comes from, I like to think of setting like a schedule for yourself, what to do day to day, sticking to that. That's discipline, and then the motivation to carry that out goes together. I think a lot of people my age, and definitely in high school and everything, lack that. Especially when they're in a vulnerable position where they think nothing's gonna get better. With that, you'll realize in time, I think time is the best healer. And that's where your motivation will come from, just time. But it has to be time well spent. And I say well spent as in not on all these gadgets too much. Like a very good healthy diet, and not just like eating, like don't be on technology too much. With relationships as well, friendships too, what you consume. I think if you try and keep all of that as just a good, strong circle of healthy, then you'll be set to get through what you need to get through.
I hope that we can have more talks like this, and I would just call it like lessons from Gen Z and intergenerational Gen X to Gen Z of helping generations even understand each other better, to come together for a better future and to be able to build resilience within each other.